Have you heard of the International Science and Engineering Fair? If you're a student researcher like us, then you probably know that already. So today, we're going to discuss one of the most important forms in doing research, the Human Participants Rule for projects involving human participants. This form, along with the research plan, is submitted by the student researcher to explain to the Institutional Review Board or IRB how the safety and well-being of the test subjects and the confidentiality of results will be ensured. But before we proceed with the rules involving human participant, let us first discuss what is considered a human participant. According to Code of Federal Regulation 45 CFR 46, a human participant is a living individual about whom an investigator conducting research obtains data or samples through intervention or interaction with individuals or identifiable private information. Examples of projects that are considered human participant research include participants in physical activities such as physical exertion, ingestion of any substance, or any research that includes medical procedure. Second, psychological, educational, and opinion studies such as surveys, questionnaires, and tests. Third, we have studies in which the researcher is the subject of the research. Fourth is the testing of student-designed invention, prototype, or computer application by human participants other than the student researcher. Fifth, we have data or record review projects that include data that are not de-identified or are anonymous, such as dataset that includes name, birthday, phone number, or other identifying variables. And lastly, we have behavioral observations that involve any interaction with observed individuals or where the researcher has modified the environment, or behavioral observations that occur in non-public or restricted access settings such as daycare settings or doctor's office. And lastly, behavioral observations that involve the recording of personally identifiable information. There are 12 rules to be followed when doing research involving human participants. These rules were developed to help pre-college student researchers adhere to the federal regulations governing professional scientists and to protect the welfare of both human participants and the student researcher. For rule number 1, student researchers must complete all elements of the human participants portion of the research plan or project summary instructions and evaluate and minimize the physical, psychological, and privacy risks to their human participants. Attached here is the human participant form, which could be used to determine the level of risk in a study involving human participants. Further details regarding this assessment will be discussed later.
Rule 2. Student research involving human participants must be reviewed and approved by an institutional review board before any interactions with human participants may begin. Projects that are conducted at school, home, or community must be reviewed and approved by the school IRB, while projects that are conducted at a regulated research institution must have IRB approval from the RRI. Rule 3. The student must comply with all determinations made by the school or RRI IRB before beginning any interaction with human participants. If the IRF requires a qualified scientist, Form 2 must be completed by the QS, while Form 3 must be accomplished if it is a designated supervisor. Rule 4. Participation in research may begin only after research participants have voluntarily given informed consent or assent. Adult research participants may give their own consent, but research participants under 18 years of age and/or individuals not able to give consent should give their assent, with the parent or guardian providing permission. Rule 5. The research study must be in compliance with all privacy laws such as US FERPA and the US HIPAA when they apply to the project. Rule 6. Students are prohibited from independently diagnosing disease, administering medication, and/or performing medical procedures on human participants. A student may observe and collect data only under the direct supervision of a licensed healthcare provider or professional, and this professional must be named in the research plan or protocol approved by the IRB.
So let us now proceed to rule number 7, which states that without the written approval of the participant, student researchers may not publish or exhibit material and information. This is under the Public Health Service Act Title 42 of United States Code. Next is rule number 8. In accordance with the instrument publisher requirements, all published instruments that are not in the public domain must be administered, scored, and interpreted by a qualified scientist. The test must be used and distributed in line with the publisher's specifications, including the acquisition of legal copies of the instrument. Studies involving data collection through the internet are authorized, but researchers should be aware that they can present difficulties, first in gathering anonymous data, in getting informed consent, and in verifying that participants are of the ideal age to give informed consent. This all falls on rule number 9. Next, rule number 10. After receiving the initial IRB approval, a student who proposes revisions to the research plan must repeat the evaluation process and regain approval before the continual interactions with human participants. Next is rule number 11. The affiliated FAIR SRC will check whether or not the researchers followed and applied all the rules in their study before the competition. Rule number 12, on the other hand, includes all the forms required for studies involving human participants. First is Student Checklist 1A, Research Bladder Project Summary Instructions, Checklist for Other Sponsor, Approval Form, Human Participants Form. There are deleted research institution, qualified scientists, risk assessment forms are only used when applicable.
Now let us move on to the IRB waiver of written informed consent or parental permission. The Institutional Review Board determines which type of consent applies to research. If the investigation only involves minimal risk and anonymous data collection, the IRB may only require a written informed consent. Aside from this, the following researches are also included. The research involves normal educational practices such as classroom assessment techniques and cooperative learning activities. The research merely investigates an individual's or group's behavioral traits with no interference from the researcher. The research tools utilized simply determine the participant's perception and cognition, which does not necessitate the collection of personal information, violation of privacy, or the risk of emotional discomfort. And finally, an RIB reviewed physical activities in which no more than minimal danger exists. Just take note that if there is any uncertainty regarding the appropriateness of waiving written informed consent or assent or parental permission, it is strongly recommended that documentation of written informed consent or assent or parental permission be obtained.
Exempt Studies. In the instance of very low-risk human research, the IRB may not require pre-approval. As a result, some of the studies can be exempted. ISEF and affiliated PERS-exempted projects are: firstly, projects where the student researcher is the only person testing the invention. Next is data review studies, in which the data are taken from publicly available pre-existing data sets. Should not involve human interaction or data collecting from a human participant. Then, studies in which the researcher does not interact with the subjects being watched and does not capture any personally identifiable data. Lastly, projects in which a student obtains pre-existing retrospective data in a de-identified anonymous format are also exempted and will not require IRB pre-approval. Human participant and IRB resources. All human participant projects are considered to have some level of risk, no more than minimal risk. There is no more than a minimal risk when the probability and magnitude of harm or discomfort are not greater than that those happen in everyday life or psychological examination or test. More than minimal risk whenever the chance of physical or psychological harm caused by a breach of confidentiality or by an invasion of privacy, there is more than minimal risk. Most of the studies require proof of informed consent or the permission of a parent or guardian for a minor to take part.
These are the examples of greater than minimal physical risk. Exercise other than ordinarily encountered in everyday life by that participant would be considered more than minimal risk. Examples: swimming 500 meters and walking the length of standard hallway. For most healthy participants or for a varsity player, this activity could be considered minimal risk. But for the general, elderly, or someone recovering from surgery, this might be considered more than minimal risk. Ingestion or tasting projects that involve commonly available food or drink will be evaluated by the IRB, which determines risk level based upon the nature of the study and local norms. IRB may deem the study more than minimal risk if the food being studied is not commonly available to students, or they believe that parents in their community would want to provide parental permission before their child to participate in the study. Exposure to hazardous material is also considered as greater than minimal risk, as it may cause harm to individuals. The following are examples of greater than minimal psychological risk that involves experimental condition that could potentially result in emotional stress. This requires documented informed consent, and a licensed mental health professional must be on the IRB reviewing these types of projects. Privacy concerns. Protecting confidentiality requires measures to ensure that identifiable research data are not disclosed to the public or unauthorized individuals. Example: collecting students' GPA. This requires the collection of research in such a way that it is impossible to connect research data with the individual who provided the data, to prevent the research participant from suffering embarrassment and feelings of distress related to invasion of his privacy. If the research study includes participants from any of the following groups, the IRB and student research must consider whether the nature of the study requires special protections or accommodation. For example, special protections will not typically be necessary to include pregnant women in a study involving performance on a cognitive test or completion of a simple survey. That's why the nature of the study is an important consideration when determining if special protections are required.
That's all for human participants rules. Thank you for listening. Have a good day.